Today, our webinar is going to talk about using the power of culture to accelerate your change management success. All right, so your panelists today, you've got Tim Kuppler and Donna Brighton, that's me. We've got a little bit of background in the topic, as you can see, and we're real excited to share with you today some 15 culture actions that you can use during the course of change management. Tim, if you talk a little bit about how this information has come to be in this collaboration of culture experts.
Sure. So human synergistics has been known for more about the quantitative side of culture assessment. And over the past few years, we've been building a collaboration of top culture experts out there, including Edgar Schein and others, holding our annual Ultimate Culture Conference. There's obviously a lot of interest in this subject of culture, but varying opinions about what really culture is and how you should go about change efforts more effectively. So we're working to bring together some of those insights so that people can be confident about what we're sharing, that it's on target with the pioneers in this space.
Fabulous. Thanks, Tim. All right, so a big question around why. And this is really a story I wanted to share before we got started. About 20 years ago, I was certified as a project manager. And although I was doing great project management, I came to realize there was something missing from my practice of project management. I found that when projects got completed on time, within budget, and according to scope, but the people part was overlooked, oftentimes the project wasn't successful. And I bet a lot of you could relate to that. So once I figured that out, I started focusing on change management and really incorporated that into my practice. As a change practitioner, I was applying great change management, learning from the top professionals, the gurus in the space. I kept running into roadblocks. It wasn't until I discovered culture that I was able to put all the pieces together. I learned how culture informs change management, and change management works with project management so that organizations can really accomplish lasting outcomes. So my why for our time together today is I really want to share my insights from my learning journey, including some of the resources that rocked my world. Tim, I don't know if there's anything that you want to share about why this subject is so important and meaningful to you.
Well, I mean, I've always been involved in big change efforts, and I came at this by not being an educator or a consultant. I was a top leader having to basically implement improvements to keep my job and, and succeed. So that's what got me interested in culture and change a long time ago, and little did I know that I'd spend my life focused on it.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, as Tim said, he was a senior leader. So sometimes you have people who come at the topic of culture or change, and they're practitioners like many of us are. But Tim served in that role as an executive leader, like he said, and really used this information to make a difference and transform his business. So he has really practical experience. So during our time today, here's what we want to accomplish. We're going to talk about the objectives of doing culturally intelligent change. And then we want to share with you 15 culture actions that we're recommending are a part of every culturally intelligent change project. And ultimately, our goal is that all of us are more successful in our change management by applying culturally intelligent change. So great focus, but what in the world is this culturally intelligent change? So here's what we're proposing. That as I shared with you in my story, I discovered when I was doing great change management and focused on understanding how to train people in the new behaviors, and we were helping people learn new processes and systems, there was something else that kept them a little stuck. So culturally intelligent change is really understanding those core elements of culture and using them to adjust your change approach. And as you do that, you'll accelerate learning and improve your results. And we're going to talk about that as we get into the 15 culture actions, how you do that and how that really helps deliver success. So the objectives of doing culturally intelligent change really boils down to this. We want to minimize resistance and maximize success. And that often during times of change, it's the culture flashpoints that create massive amounts of resistance. All right, before we dive into those 15 culture action items, I just want to level set us in terms of what is change management, because all of you brilliant practitioners, I'm sure you've got phenomenal insight into this, and I want to make sure we're aligned in how we're defining this. So I'm going to pull from the Association of Change Management Professionals standard for change management in the definition here. And you can see I'm highlighting the fact that change management is about applying a structured approach to transition from a current state to a future state to achieve expected benefits. So that's kind of a very basic explanation. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is because many of you use a structured approach, and there's lots of them. I mean, this is just a few of them. In fact, I'd love to hear from you as you look through the list. Am I missing any? Because there's an incredible number of great change management methodologies. Our goal, though, was recognizing that while there's great approaches and many fantastic methodologies, there's things that are core to each of them. And that's represented in the Association of Change Management Professionals Standard for Change Management. They have 5 key process groups. And within those process groups are the core change actions. So rather than try to match the culture actions to a specific change management methodology, we recognize that these 5 process groups are sort of foundational. And then on top of that, your particular structured approach, whatever it is that you use, whether it's one of the methodologies mentioned above or a hybrid of them, these are your ways of managing change. However, what we're trying to talk about today is the fact that as you do your change management, we want to emphasize the actions around increasing shared learning and results, because that is truly the key to culture change. So that's a little bit of how we connected these culture actions into change management, trying to remain methodology neutral and just connect back to the standard. Another important factor is that our focus is really on transformational changes in organizations. So I'd love to hear in the chat, tell me about the changes that you're working on in your organization. Do any of these resonate with you? Are you going through a merger and acquisition where you're leading change, or perhaps workplace transformation? Maybe it's a systems change or a new process or leadership change. All of you are leading different types of change. But for our purposes today, we're focused on transformational change. So we've got Jacqueline, she's working on a reorganization. Alejandra's got business model change. Rick, you're doing all 3 at one time. Wow, that's a lot of change. Sounds like you guys are pretty busy in your changes and operating in the space around transformation. And Tim, talk about, you know, as we're looking at doing these 15 culture actions, you know, this space that we're looking at with the change complexity and culture impact, how would you characterize these changes?
Well, on the change side, Shine says you're really only aware of your culture when you have to adapt to something. Mm-hmm. So obviously, the more complex the change is, the more the cultural headwinds will likely be. Mm-hmm. And on the impact scale, I mean, the more you sense on the surface that we're going to have to change some significant behavior, some significant beliefs, mm-hmm. I mean, we better understand culture as a foundation to that change management effort.
Absolutely. So again, culturally intelligent change applies to all change, but our focus is really here in the space of transformational change. Now, why is that? I'm going to make a bold statement here, and that is that very few change management plans are actually incorporating an intentional approach to culture. Now, a shout out to all of you who are practitioners, and I want to acknowledge that it's a challenge because there's oftentimes we're brought into change projects when they're already underway, so we don't have an opportunity to truly practice change management the way that we know it should be. We also may be working with leaders who believe that change management's nothing more than a communication and training strategy. So acknowledging all of that, the reality is that most change management efforts are not leveraging culture. So to that end, we're going to talk about what is culture, and I'd love to hear from you. And I can see here all the changes that you're going through. It sounds pretty intense. I see, Alexa, you're integrating global organizations. So what I'm curious about is your definition of culture. How do you define culture? What are the words that you use when somebody says, what matters to you as you're thinking about culture in the context of change? So Brad says that culture is ways of working. Jazz says how business gets done. We've got Axel who says accepted norms and behaviors. Hey, Chris, it's all about attitudes. Rick saying culture is how we do things around here and why we do them the way we do. Laura says that culture is about unspoken norms. Elena says culture is the collective beliefs of individuals. Rory says assessing and developing emotional intelligence. Amanda, we've got the written and unwritten rules, behaviors, and norms. You guys have got this. Good stuff. Jeff has the brick wall you run into when you violate a norm. Yeah, I guess you certainly do figure what out that culture is. I guess that's the unspoken part, right? So keep the definitions coming. This is fabulous. I love what you're sharing. And Tim, I'd love for you to walk us through the definition of culture.
Well, I love those definitions, and none of them were just stopping with how we do things around here. Even that one, it was about that and why.
Yes.
Which is the key. So there's many definitions out there. We talk about it being a system of shared values and beliefs that can lead to behavioral norms. The key word is can, right? It's not just what we value, because we have challenges putting it into action, and we know our organizations have been built sometimes to reinforce some things that are inconsistent with our values. But those norms, those unwritten rules, really drive how people approach their work, interact with others, and most importantly, when it comes to a change effort, solve problems.
Fabulous.
The bottom line is it's the way we are expected to do things around here. We just feel these pressures that we're bombarded by cultural norms. We feel compelled to fit in and behave in a certain way. So going counter to those, which is often required sometimes in a big transformation, it's very difficult. We've got to get into people's heads and understand what they're dealing with.
Definitely. Yeah, like Teresa says, it's the mindset, behaviors, and norms that are rewarded and encouraged in the entity, back to what we're expected to do around here.
Exactly.
Fabulous. All right, so let's get into these 15 key culture actions. And before we do, Tim, you wanted to share some guiding principles kind of that really shaped these 15 key culture actions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the number one here came from Shine, that culture is built through shared learning and mutual experience. You only create your culture one time when the organization is founded. After that point, you're having to deal with what already exists and the beliefs and assumptions that are out there. But we can't just engage people in an improvement plan that's tactically correct or just makes sense on the surface, because we have to design that to deal with climate factors, all these systems, structures that may also have to change, how leaders are leading. And we also have to customize it based on those behavioral norms, right? So if people really struggle sharing what's on their mind or involving others in decisions that impact them, we have to deal with what's going on in this organization and how's it been built to encourage something, differently. So we want to drive that shared learning, but customize the approach based on an understanding of both climate and culture.
So Tim, what you're telling me then, I can't just come up with my values and share them with the organization and change my culture.
No, we can't deal with the ideal side of things, what we value, that's great, saying what we want. We have to understand what currently exists and even go deeper than that. What are the beliefs, assumptions reinforcing that? And how's this organization been built to reinforce that, and how we reward, and many other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, excellent grounding. So now that we have those guiding principles, let's kick things off. Again, we're referencing back to the standard and the process groups, and you tuck these into whatever methodology that you use. But generally, all change management approaches begin with some type of evaluation where you're determining the change impact and org readiness. So under that, we've defined 5 specific things that are really important, 5 of the 15 key culture actions that take place during this stage. The first one we're going to look at is assessing the culture and climate, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So I'm going to bring up here, Tim, the culture and climate, because I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. We've been talking up to this point about culture, but now you're saying we actually need to assess culture and climate.
Yeah, both are critical, and this goes back to that 1%, number you gave about change management approaches, truly addressing culture. Many of them are actually addressing climate. And maybe we collect some information about the behavior we see on the surface, or involvement, or how we're collaborating or communicating, or things like that. But it's extremely rare for us to capture information on behavioral norms, right? And that's really where we're getting to the level of culture. So do people feel expected to take on challenging tasks, proactively share their ideas, and all the good stuff we want in changes? Or are we dealing with norms that are out there where people feel they can never make a mistake, or they can't rock the boat, or let's push decisions upward? And these types of norms in any change effort are going to be crippling. So it doesn't help us a lot to understand just the behavior we see on the surface. We've got to understand norms, what people value. Those are in the realm of culture, and it's very rare for them to be assessed in a very thorough way as part of a major change management effort.
Absolutely. And Tim, sometimes I think it's interesting, people may mistake some behaviors as resistance, like somebody doesn't want to change, when actually it's something deeper. There's like some cultural things going on.
Exactly. We've got to go beyond the behavior we see on the surface, right? Just like the chat about how we do things around here and why. If we don't understand those beliefs and assumptions, we're not getting to the realms of culture.
Absolutely.
So we try to understand those from 2 perspectives, right? The ideal side is what people value and believe leads to effectiveness, right? You're going to have a hard time involving people in decisions if people don't value that and think it's important. But on the other side of things, the current culture, we want to assess behavioral norms. What really are those unwritten rules that's driving the vast majority of the behavior we see on the surface? And usually there's gaps. And as part of the change efforts, we might need to see from to shift in some specific behaviors or norms that are going to be critical for change success. And we may not change the culture of the whole organization through our change management project, but we at least need to design the interactions in a culturally intelligent way and start to reinforce those 2 behaviors as part of the process. So just some examples on the ideal side, we of course want to see things like this list on the left, where we're involving people in decisions that impact them. We're thinking ahead and planning, but often in organizations, there'll be these difficult norms that look like things on the right, where we're switching priorities, we're taking few chances, we're just going along with things. So the assessment process, both quantitative and qualitative, helps us get a language around this. The qualitative gives us the unique language and what's going on in the stories and the examples, but it can be hard to align that and bring it together if we don't have a quantitative tool of some sort that's in the mix. So this is my last slide on some human synergistics content, but we use this How Culture Works model. Starting left to right, we get a picture of what that ideal culture looks like, and we use this circumflex visual. It's always very blue. where we want these very constructive things that are to be part of our culture. On the right side, in the current culture, we might see these red and green, which are aggressive and passive norms that are out there that we need to understand. Those two pieces, the ideal and the current, are cultural. The other two columns are in the climate. So we call these causal factors, the things that may be causing a disconnect between what we value and the norms that exist in the organization. And then the outcomes are, of course, important, and we need to understand them for individuals, teams, and the organization. So a lot's involved with a thorough culture and climate assessment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Tim, just from experience, one of the things that's really helpful is having objective data, right? Something that everybody can level set on.
Absolutely. And that's the challenge with qualitative alone approaches. It's hard to engage everybody.
Right.
And we may struggle with, well, I don't think it's that, it's this. But at least if you've got some quantitative behind it, there is some facts we can ground ourselves around.
Exactly. So back to these 15 key culture actions, number one being do an assessment of some sort. And we highly recommend an actual culture tool. And like Tim talked about, there's difference between culture and climate, and it's important to assess both factors.
And on the qualitative side, we want to understand these gaps between what we say is important, make decisions on the front line, satisfy your customers, and the reality of what the behavior might look like, and then understand why. Mm-hmm. Well, why is there this gap between we say this is important in our organization, but we're doing something else?
Absolutely. And there was actually a situation where I was working with an organization that wanted to start doing change management, and we said, time out, before we move into implementing any kind of change management, we need to understand the culture. Because the methodology itself, while will be excellent, but uninformed by culture can't be successful.
Well, I mean, as you know, this number one here, evaluate, it's often either completely skipped or just covered on the surface, and it really compromises the entire process.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've assessed the culture and climate, both qualitatively and quantitatively, and then we said the next key culture action, again, this complements the change approach you're already using, is identifying the changes in specific norms and behaviors that you're going to target for successful change. So you kind of teased that out a little bit in the previous slides, but tell us a bit more about that.
Well, that's about the from-to shift. Mm-hmm. When it comes to this digital transformation or whatever we're zeroing in on, what are a few specific shifts in behavior and some of the beliefs and assumptions that might be underpinning them about those frontline decisions or what I am empowered to do that we'll have to shift, that even if we're enabling something with technology or whatever it might be, we have to deal with these underlying entrenched beliefs.
Yeah.
So let's get a specific from-to shift. All the pioneers say, hey, you can't change a bunch of behaviors all at the same time. Mm-hmm. We got to zero in on a critical few and build from there.
So it's interesting because I know probably one of the top things leaders today ask for is like break down silos, right? Like that's going to be the action. And so here we are in this change project and we're trying to say, okay, well, we're going to break down silos. But to your point about from and to, what does that really mean?
What's that look like, right?
And what is behaviors? And then what are some of the underlying beliefs as well, right? Like people are doing those things for a reason, back to your shared learning.
Right, exactly. If we're not involving other team members or other groups, right, or we're not sharing information transparently, why? And that's a good grounding place. Well, I don't have time, or I don't know who to share it with, or we don't have a system that allows that information to flow or us to engage easily.
Right.
Got to get to the underlying cultural aspects.
And that's why this is so important, because people say things like, well, just break down the silos. You know, people need to start talking to other team members more often. But what does that really mean? And that's why this is important.
And leaders can get frustrated.
Yes.
You know, oh, we don't need to get into all that detail. Let's just break down the silos. That's enough.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to work if we're looking for sustainable change.
Exactly. So number 3 is around clearly defined success. And we've got these 15 culture actions described in greater detail in a checklist that we'd love to share with all of you. So there's a little more behind this, because what we found is the success piece needs to include that ideal culture, or what kind of from a future state standpoint, not just the new system or process. You know, some of you that are going through changes are talking about the integration. You know, so great, we've got a merger of two companies, but what does that really look like successfully from a culture standpoint?
Right. We want to get into the two side of the from to shift and those specific behaviors and some of the beliefs that need to emerge if this is really going to be a successful transformation.
Mm-hmm. So then once we've got the success clearly defined, the next step we talk here is around aligning core change team and leadership team members. This is a really kind of a big aha for me, because I never thought of the change team. Well, yes, they're leading the initiative, but they actually can participate in modeling the new behaviors, right? So talk to us about, as you're aligning the core change team and the leaders, what does that look like? What's that about?
Well, I mean, people talk about the shadow of the leader and how impactful leadership behavior is. Well, with a change management approach, it actually starts with the change team. And if they're not operating with those two behaviors in mind from the very start, right, how could you ever expect top leaders to show them? So often the change team is being a guide and helping to coach leadership on what's really going to be necessary with this change effort. So they better both be aligned with that shadow of a leader.
Right. And the other thing I think that's important at this point is making sure people are starting from the same place.
Right.
Because sometimes if you've got a leader, and you probably, all of you on the phone, you may have experienced this, where leaders are like 6 months or a year in the future. They're already believing that the future has come. And so they're not necessarily aligned with the current state and what's actually going on.
Well, and we go back to the assess, because in that assessment, we're understanding subcultures and how the experience may be quite differently up in the ivory tower and what they experience. And, you know, they might think things are pretty constructive. They don't run into the same obstacles as the front line. So it's not as simple as just saying, you know, the team, core team and leadership need to show these behaviors, because they're dealing with very different challenges.
Absolutely. So first 5 culture actions, we're assessing the culture and climate, identifying the changes, leveraging that to create that clear success definition, getting the change team and leadership aligned and on board with those changes. And then finally, as you're completing this particular area of change management, just making sure that your change impact and org readiness are informed by that assessment. That's really, really critical, so that you're then translating that as you move forward in defining your change management strategy and creating the plan.
Well, even on that org readiness, I know we include some questions about org readiness as just a standard part of the assessment process. And it's amazing. We even ask questions about, well, you know, who's really willing to accept this change, and ask that at different levels, you know, top leadership versus the front lines. And often people will provide feedback that top leaders are actually the greatest inhibitor to the change.
Right.
And you can't ever, you know, just move forward and, oh, we'll just have to get them involved later. You have to deal with that issue right up front.
Great. So that's the first 5 of the 15 actions. Now moving into formulating the change management strategy and developing the change management plan. Now in the standard, these are separated, but as we created those culture actions, we recognize that often those things are done maybe simultaneously. So we matched these next 4 culture actions against the creation of the strategy and plan. So again, the recommendation was using the culture and climate insights from your assessment as you shape the strategy for change management. And then the next one, Tim, talking about prioritizing the key levers for change and incorporating them into the change management plans.
Right. So this is where we have to dive into many different areas that could be reinforcing that current culture and some of those from behaviors or norms we're seeing, right? Everything from the philosophy and mission of the organization to goal setting and how that process works, to involvement, empowerment, and things more at a structural and system level. In technology, get into job design, is there sufficient autonomy, variety, and things like that. And then in skills and qualities, it's how supervisors and managers are leading and showing consideration for others. So there's a lot of levers here, I guess, that need to be addressed from a change perspective, but also more broadly that could be reinforcing that current state. So even though it might not be directly part of that digital transformation or whatever we're dealing with, we have to deal with it at a system level, or we're not going to see the behavior we need.
Absolutely. And the output from this particular part of the culture assessment's been invaluable in shaping change plans.
Right, because the operating model of the organization or the business is reinforcing the current culture by definition, right? It's just emerged to be that way. And we might have to make some tough shifts. And a good place to start is on a specific change management area and not tackling our entire communication system, our entire goal setting system. Let's learn on one change effort how to do something more effectively, and maybe it will be a bigger change later.
Right. So again, prioritizing those key levers for change and then putting those into the appropriate change management plans is a key culture action. And then this is one I really wanted to park on, because Tim, of all the different actions, this is really the essence of creating culture shift.
Yeah, I mean, this is it, that there has to be by design these feedback loops where we're genuinely asking, hey, what's working? Why? Do we really understand it, or are we just playing along? Shine talks about don't be seduced by the illusion that behavior change is culture change, right? People can play along really well and follow procedures and stuff, and then when we're done with the big change effort and have to juggle everything else and manage 10 other changes, amazing how we can revert to the behavior we were seeing before. So we got to get that feedback loop on what's working, why, do we understand it, and then what's not living up to expectation and why. And this requires changing that strategy and plan based on what we learn, which many change management professionals may struggle with. We put so much work in that original plan. What do you mean? We got to go back to the drawing board and address some new things. That's another big Shine learning, is you're really only beginning to understand your culture when you try and change it. So new things emerge that might not be part of your original strategy and plan and have to be addressed.
So I'd love to hear from all of you in the chat. What are some ways that you've incorporated feedback channels or learning loops in your change practice? What are some of the things you've done? And an example of this could be in creating, and there's a whole bunch of different names for them, but like a change advisory team or some type of group that you are intentionally working with around learning the impact of the communications that are being shared with the organization. Are they being received? Do people truly understand what's going on? And is there truly change happening, or is it getting lost? I like to call there's sort of this change distortion field where leaders think they're communicating really clearly and it comes through that, and that message does not reach the rest of the frontline employees. So what do you put in place? What are some of those ways? And we've got the leveraging middle managers. So Bert, thanks for sharing that. Kim was saying she would use global change advocacy team engagement surveys to really understand and use that to facilitate learning. Jakeem said change ambassadors. Elena was saying using skip level meetings that are hosted by leaders so that the leaders themselves actually get that feedback, using change agent networks and sometimes internal social media. Allison talked about setting up listening tours so that you can go out to the organization, not just sitting, as sometimes people talk about being in the ivory tower. We've got Tracy talking about the employee engagement team and getting volunteers from key groups. Kim suggested focus groups. Amanda said facilitated feedback sessions. So lots of great ideas here on how to incorporate feedback channels and loops. And then again, not just get that information, but actually make adjustments. And as all of you practitioners know from a change standpoint, that's some of the key work that we have to do, and sometimes pretty frustrating to project managers because they just want a Gantt chart, right? That you check off all the tasks and get it done. And sometimes you have to go back and revisit some of those key change approaches and things that you're planning to do.
And one of the big challenges is, we don't want a big long list of feedback either.
Mm-hmm.
So where we can use prioritization with groups to engage them in the process.
Right.
So they feel listened to. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
maybe my specific idea or issue wasn't addressed, but hey, our top 3 were, and we are at least, trying to do it in a thoughtful way.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other ideas are keeping those initial assessment focus groups together and going back to them, because they start to learn, what is really kind of culture and the process to unearth that, and keeping them together through the change effort can be really effective.
Mm-hmm. So Olivia talks about using communities of practice. She's curious if anybody else uses communities of practice. So if you do, go ahead and chat into all participants and let Olivia know that. And Bert has shared that he also has used the root learning maps to engage employees in the process. And Tim, I know there's a new learning map that's coming out, right?
Yeah, we're really excited about a new learning experience called the Culture Journey that we've developed with Root as a way to educate people about culture, climate, and change.
So lots of great ways and approaches for defining feedback channels and loops to ensure that people have shared learning and you get your results.
And one key point is the results is a key part of this, of course, because you have to show new behavior. It has to lead to a positive result for a sustained period of time for it ever to have a chance of influencing the culture. So the more we can share stories, examples of where people have shown this behavior, we followed our process and it led to a result, people don't even have to be engaged in showing that behavior themselves to learn from it. So that's key with sharing the stories and example of behavior and results.
Mm-hmm. So Olivia, it looks like there's quite a few people who do use those centers of excellence. And I also wanted to let you all know, you've been sharing incredible input. I'm going to be capturing all this and we're going to make this available to you as well. So for all this great insight on how you define feedback loops and channels and use those in your change practice, we'll be sharing that back with you.
Awesome.
All right, so we've talked about using the culture and climate insights to shape our strategy, prioritizing those key levers for change, and using that to shape the change management plans. We just talked about making sure that these feedback channels and loops are there. And then the last point under the, I guess number 9 in the culture actions is making sure there's a management system. And that can sound a little bit funny. And I want to acknowledge that when you're doing great project management, this is probably incorporated in that, but tell us, Tim, why that's so incredibly important.
Well, there always has to be a management system for priorities and goals, whether it's a change management approach or the overall organization. But often it may not be as disciplined in the connections across levels. Mm-hmm. So the change management team might be all over it, but how well is that connected to, let's say, the senior leadership team? Mm-hmm. And then how well does that flow directly in communication across the organization? So often this is, a killer as far as if there's not a disciplined management system that connects across the change team, to top leadership, to communication across the organization.
Right. So hopefully that's in place, but we call it out as something incredibly important, because if it's not there, the culture work won't be successful.
And this is climate.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But it helps guide the culture.
Absolutely. All right, so we've hit 1 through 9, and let's move on through 10 through 13. This is the key culture actions when you're actually executing on the change management plan. So whatever process step that happens to be in your particular method, we've got 4 actions here. The first one is leaders and change team understand and demonstrate the targeted behaviors. And what's interesting, again, we often talk leaders need to model the change, but how many of you have thought, hey, maybe our change teams can actually play a role in this?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The change team may have to go first before leaders, because what's going to encourage leaders to show these behaviors is that they're starting to get some positive feedback and examples. Hey, this is starting to work, or this might really help. So it's not all this thing of, hey, everybody has to make this huge personal transformation all in one step.
Right.
It's this process of driving shared learning and results that encourages people to show more of the behavior and to put themselves out there and to be more transparent and honest through the process.
Mm-hmm. Very important. And then we've got evaluating the impact of the norms and behaviors, the culture and climate changes, and then making the adjustments as necessary. So that's why the cyclical nature of the arrows there, where as you're executing, and you said that, Tim, that culture often rears its ugly head. Jeff, I think you talked about running into a brick wall here, and that can happen.
Right. So are we, I've seen organizations when they lay out that from to shift, they'll actually measure in some way, hey, are we seeing those two behaviors now, or are we still seeing the from? So they're at least trying to get a consistent feedback loop on, are we not just, following the process, we are actually showing the behavior and dealing with the problems and challenges in a way we are targeting.
And then you actually mentioned this in the last group of actions, but communicating that progress, recognizing and reinforcing new behavior. So really sharing the stories, because people learn not just from their own experience, but from others' experience through stories.
Back to that important fundamental about it being all about shared learning and results, right? It's the connection of the two, and what behavior was shown that was a critical part of it. So much in change management effort, it's all about the technical side, and the behavioral side is just as critical. So that's got to come out in these stories and examples, and others learn from it. There's always a few people that go first, but everyone else learns from those stories and examples how they can potentially behave or engage in a different way.
And one of the things I like to say is that stories are really the programming language of an organization. So for those of you on the phone, I would love to hear in the chat, what ways do you use to share stories? Is it something that you've formalized and worked on in your organization to make sure those stories are communicated? Because they're incredibly powerful. And I've found in organizations that have mastered the discipline of sharing those new stories with the new behaviors and the new belief systems, that's what really transforms culture. So have any of you used or implemented a formal storytelling approach or ways in which to capture and help the rest of the organization learn those stories? So Olivia talked about connect to purpose storytelling. We've got voice of the customer, so being able to share with the organization. Vox Pops, Chris, that's great. That sounds like a new kind of popsicle. Teresa talked about internal news feeds, webinars, and intranet. Amanda said by asking employees to share even the smallest success in staff meetings. So then it's not just leadership sharing the stories, but they're hearing it from their peers. Alexa talked about a StoryCorps style of sessions with employees and using coffee buddy sessions. So great input. We've got Yammer posts. So wonderful suggestions here on sharing through story. The last item is around surfacing and addressing gaps in behavior. And this is important because a lot of times leaders will say, well, these are the new behaviors and this is how, how things need to be. But yet we find some folks that slide into the old behaviors, and if there's not consequences, or at least not the difficult conversations calling them out, it can almost seem, I think somebody earlier in the chat was talking about, if you just allow people to behave in the wrong way, it's pretty much agreeing that it's okay.
And the key here is this is not just jump to accountability, it's jump to understand. But if we're still seeing those from behaviors in spite of new systems we've implemented or training we've conducted, we need to understand why, right? So the culture work doesn't stop with the assessment.
Right.
It's a continual process to understand, hey, if we see patterns that are inconsistent with what we need to understand why. We engage them first. Hey, if it is an accountability issue and we've done everything we can, and many are showing that we can show this behavior and do it in an effective way, but there's just these resistors, we have to deal with it and work through it. There's no getting around it.
Definitely. And Frederick even says the top leaders need to acknowledge wrong behavior first and do something about it, so they're walking the talk.
Well, and it's so powerful when leaders will be vulnerable and admit that they've shown it, you know, or that they've had challenges with it and share, versus just, you know, ignoring it. Let's deal with something else.
Yes, yes. And I love what Rick was saying also about the storytelling. The key is taking the time for sharing the stories, not just keeping busy. So absolutely true. They do no good if you don't pass them on. All right, so we've covered 10 through 13, and the last two, you've completed the change management effort. Yay, congratulations, check the box, and everybody walks off into the sunset, right? Not so much.
Not so much. That darn shared learning word seems to go through all these steps.
So the recommendations here, that key culture actions, are making sure that any culture-related learnings, not earnings, get included in the lessons learned conversation, as well as the sustainability plan. Now, you may have different language in your methodology, but this is that idea of transition to operations. It's okay, the change has been done and the change team's rolling off, but how are you making sure that that change is sustained? And the last action, as a really important way of making sure that happens, is ensuring that there's ongoing culture and climate assessment.
Right, the first time through, really adjusting your change effort based on, you know, really thorough culture and climate analytics, you know, that's tough. But the reward is actually the second. Figured out our way to integrate it in our change management effort. So now we can really focus on optimizing it with future change efforts and other sustainability plans.
Definitely. So there we go. Those are the 15 key culture actions. And again, thanks everyone for your feedback. We're going to be capturing that and sharing it back with anybody who's interested. And I would love, if you had any questions, go over to the Q&A tab, and please feel free to tap them in there. We'll get to as many as we can, and we'll make sure for those of you who we don't get to your questions, we will respond. So again, doing culturally intelligent change following these 15 culture actions, our goal is to minimize change resistance and maximize your sustainable change results.
There's one thing I wanted to emphasize before people jump off that may not be wanting to give questions is you owe it to yourself, actually, to understand this topic, the whole culture and climate subject in connection to change, that even if your organization, you can't get enough momentum behind really adjusting your approach, you owe it to yourself to pilot it, to try some of these things, because it's here to stay. If major change efforts don't deal with culture, you know, they're going to be running into brick walls like the person chatted. So you owe it to yourself to at least start piloting things, trying to go deeper, more thoroughly, so you can learn and be more effective as a change manager.
Definitely. So a couple insights for you, and then some resources to share and some questions to answer quickly. So I wanted to emphasize the fact that change saturation is real, meaning that there can be a point where there's more change in the organization than people feel that they can absorb. So your glass becomes overflowing with change. And Tim, we had a really good conversation on this and why culture is so significant in this context.
Right. I mean, the frustrating thing here is, you know, we're managing these 100 different things, and with culture change, it's not like they all have to be managed at a whole new level for progress to be made. The whole point is to agree to zero in on a specific change management effort and to say, we're going to engage differently here, more thoroughly on this one, to learn quickly so we can spread what we learned to other change efforts. It's not about saying, oh, we're going to prioritize and forget about the other 99. Nope, we're going to engage differently on one or two of the most significant ones.
By applying culturally intelligent change. Awesome.
Yes.
So a reminder, too, of these guiding principles. And there's been a lot of questions whether you're going to receive the deck, so we will make a copy of the presentation and the recording available for those of you who are like to go through it again. One other point I wanted to make, and we hear a lot that sponsorship is the #1 most important thing in change efforts, and it is incredibly important. But sometimes it's like, okay, well, what does that really mean, and how do leaders really need to show up? And this came from a session I did with an executive leadership team where they got so excited about the ideal culture they just identified, and they couldn't wait to go share with the rest of the organization these new behaviors that everybody was going to be doing. And one of the leaders stood up and said, wait a minute, before we get all excited and start proclaiming this new ideal culture, we need to start with us. We need to be the change. Then we can do the change. So we're actually demonstrating what this looks like. And that finally earns us the right to talk about the change. So I love that, be, do, say, versus just telling leaders, oh, go communicate about the change. So something that I learned that I think is really terrific. All right, so we had a couple questions. Some of them we can get to. Tim, one of the questions here was, what's going on culturally when there's an organization that does an annual engagement survey and then doesn't want to do any other surveys? They call it survey fatigue. How do you overcome this?
Well, of course, I run into it all the time, and I just say, well, you have survey fatigue in part because you've never done a culture survey. Mm-hmm. You've never done the full MRI. So all those pulses and other things aren't getting to the sustainable changes you need. Mm-hmm. And the communication, of course, has to be different about, hey, we're going to the level of culture now, and it's going to require the qualitative side just as much as a survey. And you share what we're going to do on the qualitative front also to really get to why, we're dealing with certain, problems or challenges and why they're so deeply entrenched. So open communication is the only way to overcome it. But the technical side of culture versus climate and why engagement isn't getting to the level of culture is also incredibly important.
Absolutely. There was another question. Isn't part of intelligent change also to use certain aspects of the culture as a catalyst for change?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And that's why there's no one culture in an organization. We'll find subcultures and groups that have found ways to operate in a more constructive way and to show some of those two behaviors in spite of what we're dealing with. We need to learn from them, because if they've figured it out in our own organization, then they're going to be some of the greatest people to engage in the change effort, because they're going to do it in a naturally more inclusive way.
Absolutely. Well, Tim, we just have a few more minutes and some more fabulous questions. So would love to answer those. For those of you who did ask them, we'll get back to you. One other one was, can you recommend a specific culture and climate survey that can be leveraged?
Just might have one for you. It's called the Organizational Culture Inventory, or OCI, and we offer that with our Organizational Effectiveness Inventory, or OEI, at Human Synergistics around the world.
Great, thanks, Tim. All right, so in our last couple of minutes together, I don't know about all of you, I love reading. So I wanted to share with you some books, and the reason these are being recommended is I think it's really helpful to read great books, not only from wonderful thinkers. Dr. Edgar Schein's one of my favorites, and I have to say in grad school, his insights rocked my world. But I love hearing from leaders who have actually gone through the process of leading culture change. My latest favorite is Hit Refresh, just really fascinating insights. In fact, one of the comments that was made is that the C in CEO stands for culture. That's how important it is. So just a couple of resources to recommend there. Tim, you want to talk about some things coming up with?
Sure. So some of you may be at ACMP I've got a master class there. I think there were just a few open seats in that one, but we'll be using that culture learning map. We also have our blog at constructiveculture.com. That's the Human Synergistics blog, and then cultureuniversity.com is a more open resource. And then we accredit change management professionals and others in our tools. So you can come to our workshop, learn about the OCI, OEI, and then you also receive a project discount that you can use on your first assessment back at your organization. So we have a full schedule on our website.
Excellent. All right, a couple other things for all of you, and you'll receive an email follow-up that will give you the link to the recording, the presentation, and also would love to hear from you if you have any questions to follow up on this. We're going to be having a follow-up webinar on April the 24th, where we're going to dive into the application of these 15 culture actions in a specific change project. We also have for you a culture and change management checklist that covers those 15 culture actions, and we'll be releasing a white paper with a whole lot more detail for you. One other opportunity is we've got the Change Leader Toolkit available for all of you. This is intended to help leaders be more successful as they're dealing with multiple changes, ensuring that in just 10 minutes a day, they're paying attention to change. So that's available for all of you. And with that, Tim, is there any closing words?
No, I mean, I know we've been working together for probably 6 or 7 years on the integration of change and culture. So we wanted to cover this webinar to really distill down some key insights, and hopefully it was helpful.
Thank you all for your participation, and I hope you have a terrific and tremendous rest of your Tuesday, if it happens to be Tuesday when you're listening, or whatever other day of the week it happens to be. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.